The session before coffee is Graham Turner, who's a senior scientist at the CSIRO Sustainable Ecosystems Division, and is a modeler essentially. His training was in applied physics, and is very interested in scenario setting. And one of the things that Graham's been doing has been looking at revisiting the limits to growth and the controversy around that. Graham.
My interest in the limits to growth came about because of doing the Australian work on the sustainability of Australia. We were tarred with the brush of the limits to growth, and so I really wanted to see what this was all about. Of course, everyone here is too young to have read The Limits to Growth, right? So just a little reminder here. But the myth is that they said we would run the Limits to Growth said we would run out of resources by the end of the last century, and that just is simply not true. If you read cover to cover, it's not in there at all. So we can correct that very easily. Just another reminder that this Limits to Growth work was a global model looking at all of the subsystems of the global system interacting, mainly population, the resources, industry, agriculture, the services as well, and of course pollution. And there's more detail in there. For instance, there is sort of an urban component as well, but we don't sort of get to see that in the stuff that I'm looking at. They tested lots and lots of different scenarios. We're just going to look at three. Something called, so basically continuing on with policies and behaviours as we do now. Then a comprehensive technology scenario, trying to solve the problems by the sole use of technology. And then a stabilised world scenario. So they did their modelling in the early 70s and ran this out to the end of this century. It occurred to me we had 30 years of data now to compare with their scenarios. So in the next half a dozen slides, I think, they all kind of look like this. I'm just showing a graph of each particular main part of the outcome of the model. And you see the grade part here. So in this case, we're clearly looking at population. And this part is the history where they calibrated their model, and then their scenarios started from 1970 and went forward. And in each graph, there are three scenarios there. The green line is the business as usual. The red is the comprehensive technology, and then the blue is the stabilised world. And these solid dots are the data that I've collected for comparison to the scenarios. So here we see population has effectively doubled since 1970 and lies very closely to the business as usual, as well as the technology scenario. Now if we look at food per capita, that has been growing slowly and most closely matches again the business as usual scenario. In the stabilised world scenario, they were looking at improving food to help people attain a better lifestyle and then sort of saturating that. We see that trend is flattening out though. Services per capita, so this is to do with health and education, for example. This looks more positive. So I've used a couple of different data sets here, some based on literacy, some based on electricity, because those relate to education and health. And again, it's close to a number of the scenarios, but arguably closer to the business as usual. I guess you may have already picked, I didn't point out earlier on, that you can see some of these things drop fairly early in the piece, sometimes as early as 2020 in the business as usual scenario. The industrial output per capita has a couple of functions in this world model. One is it's a measure of our material wealth. But of course it's also supplying the goods and capital to the rest of the system, like agriculture. So here again we see an increase, about a 50% increase on 1970 levels. Again, matching pretty closely the business as usual, not going anywhere near the gun-ho comprehensive technology scenario. And there's a little bit of movement, a little bit of variability in there associated, I presume, with the oil crisis and recessions of late 70s, 80s. Here's a picture of the resources. This is an aggregate resource, so in effect lumping all of energy and all of minerals together in the one measure. And I think this gels with Damon's point before, that we're not running out of resources per se. So now I collected two different estimates, an upper and lower, an optimistic and less optimistic estimate of what was in the ground in the first place, and this is mostly to do with energy resources, and that gives me the two curves here. So if we're more optimistic about what was originally there in the ground, we're tracking along the comprehensive technology scenario, but maybe arguably we're actually on the business as usual. And the key point here is, even though we don't run out of those resources, as we go down this profile, it takes more and more energy to get the remaining bit out, and so that feeds on itself. Finally, pollution, and so for the comparison here, I simply used carbon dioxide concentrations as the measure to compare with their aggregate global pollution variable. And we can see that basically this has increased above background levels quite dramatically. So we've had roughly a tripling in this measure from the 1970s. Again, matching the business as usual scenario. And we could explore the issue, I suppose, in more detail about whether this matches the IPCC projections. I think there is some matching there. So I tried to capture here a sense of what happens in the business as usual scenario. It's a little complicated because there are all sorts of feedbacks going on. But if we run down that list, we see an increasing population and a demand for material wealth. And that drives the industrial output, which requires more resources, so we start tracking down on those. That in itself requires more industrial output, and that creates greater pollution. One of the key features in this particular scenario is that the industrial capital, therefore, is not maintained at the same level, and that system actually starts to collapse, which means that it tends not to be able to support the food system. And then, but with the lag in with growing pollution, that also affects food. So eventually, the food system collapses, and that brings down the population. You see some of the timeframes for these, while it's sort of mid-century, some of them are 2020 when we start seeing turnover in this scenario. I don't think we should read too much into those particular dates. It's just to get a feel for the major interactions that are going on. So if I could quickly say some other summary comments about the limits to growth. There were clearly other scenarios which showed the system coming apart for other reasons at slightly different times. The general message here is that as we try to solve one problem in one area, it's like squeezing a balloon, it tends to blow out in another. And that's our real issue, is the simultaneous nature of these things. They also found early action was required, and so if on the basis of their modelling, we may have already passed the time when some decline is inevitable. And a key conclusion from their sustainable world model is that it was a combination of technological progress and a less materialistic lifestyle, if I could put it simply like that. And interpreting their numbers, just to give us something simple to hang on, I would say we're looking at something like, that would mean something like a 1950s lifestyle in terms of material ownership. Maybe one or less cars per household, these being 50% smaller, no use of air conditioning, that sort of thing. Now, if I could just quickly run through some of the Australian material to show a bit more detail there. I'm not going to speak to this diagram. It's here simply to remind me and hopefully convince you that our Australian stocks and flows framework is based on a mass balance process where we look at the things needed by the population, consumables, building, transport, and all of these mass balance relationships chunk down through the industrial system, primary sector. And it's a bit like having a flight simulator and exploring whether you're crashing the plane or then going back and learning from that and flying it a different way. Okay, so population is clearly on the increase, and yes, I saw the article in The Age this morning, and we are on this upper trajectory with high immigration and a good part of our increase coming from increased natural birth as well. So heading for between 30 and 40 million by the middle of the century. One key thing I'd like to communicate is we're sort of adding a new Canberra every single year. Yeah, I mean, well, some of us love it, but translate it to another of your favourite towns pretending to be a city. But that sort of communicates the extent of the challenge we face. Imagine making this new Canberra completely self-reliant on water and energy and so forth each year forever, and then we still got to deal with the resident 21 and so million people at the same time. Even that population growth does not help us with the ageing issue. So even if we're on a high immigration profile, we're still going to get an older population. And I won't go through this argument based on the dependency ratio, but that suggests to me that instead of working 10 hours a day, we're going to have to work 12 or 13 if we're wanting to maintain the same sort of support. I really don't want to go there. Agriculture, just a snapshot to show over a long history, 1.5 centuries, we've been producing a lot of our export and our own food, of course, on the basis of 2% per annum increase in agricultural area, which is, you can't keep doing that. You gobble the Australian landmass in no short time. So if you hold it steady into the future, as we're sort of attempting to do, unfortunately that means we then have to deal with land degradation, which has been masked by the addition of new bits of land in the past. And that sort of catches up to us in about 5 decades. Of course, agriculture uses a lot of water, and here we see this dramatic increase in irrigation, water for irrigation. On the right here, we're looking at the extractions from the MurrayDarling system, and if you can make out this line at the top, that's its average annual outflow. And this is a little bit out of date too. So there's this tiny bit left for flows, and even that massive 500 gigalitres is just this thin wedge that we were going to give back to the MurrayDarling, is this thin wedge here. Bringing water a little closer to home here in this venue, this is some of our more recent modelling throughout Victoria, but just focusing on the Thomson, supplying a lot of Melbourne's water. And we see here some history over a few decades of the flow, and then factoring in what used to be a high climate change scenario is probably more closer to a medium or sort of likely scenario, and we see the river flow decreasing on average, particularly if you try and maintain the water in the reserve, Thomson Reserve. And of course, if you impose this sort of variability or even greater on it, we could be seeing these things stopping flowing by the middle of the century or earlier. Oil, very relevant to this topic and Damien's previous talk. Another quick snapshot of the past and future, potential futures. We've been producing a lot of our own oil, not quite meeting our own needs, but depending on the population scenario and other assumptions you might make, here's our needs projected into the future. And one of the likely profiles of domestic production of oil which could imply that we need to, if it were available, import 80% of our oil, by 2030. And we could try and deal with these with changes to other fuels or gas, but we quickly end up in the same situation. Again, trying to make it a little more relevant to cities and transport for this forum, if we look at the ageing profile of buildings, if I could just summarise by saying, in the future, 1/3 of the buildings in 2050 may still be around, having been made at this time. So they, it comes with all their energy and water use characteristics. There's a similar sort of message associated with the ageing of power plants. This is a little complicated to explain. I hope maybe I can just quickly get across the message that the need for a rapid change to be able to achieve 60 or 90% reduction targets by the end of 2050 might mean that in a matter of years we have to be able to build electricity generation plant that is essentially carbon free, because so much will still be around in 2050. So I think I have actually come to the end of all of this data and forecasting, and just summarising again, we're basically tracking on the limits to growth scenario. Some of these effects, according to that modelling, as aggregate as it is, could be that we'll see it in 2020. We also seem to see the same sort of dilemmas playing out in the same sort of time frame in the Australian system. And if we tease that apart more and do other scenarios, we can see that technology is just simply not enough to deal with this problem. And in fact, it may even make it worse through the rebound effect. So if I could finish there.
So can I ask a question? I think the limits to growth scenario had a population collapse of, 6 billion to 2 billion by 2100?
Yes, that's right.
And that's playing out?
Well...
Sorry, sorry, no, what I'm saying is playing out. But if what you're saying is you're confirming the projections to date?
To date.
And therefore, if the curve happens
yes.
when it said it was going to happen, you're talking about that sort of population collapse?
That's right. That's the magnitude of the change, if all of the parameters and assumptions still hold true.
So here's a question which we'll come to later, which is about the patchiness of the story. Because what's not factored into your story is wealth, poverty, yes. inequality of effects. So one thing I suspect that sits behind people's mind, which they don't like to admit to, is it's going to happen over there. So that, and just be utterly ruthless about it, that the population collapse will be in India, sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and we'll be okay. It'll be expensive, but we'll be okay. Is there any differentiation of effects in terms of the collapse?
Not in the limits to growth modelling. It was an aggregate population. They identified those really important issues of equity or inequity, but couldn't distinguish in terms of their modelling. But I would say, if we look at the Australian data and modelling, that we're looking at the same issues, and so we aren't going to be immune from those, and particularly in such an interconnected world.
So you think people will die in Australia or live less long?
That could be on the cards if the things play out like the modelling suggests.
Just very briefly, we retreat to a 1950s lifestyle. Life expectancy in 1950 was about 65, something like that, 60, 65. Do we have to retreat to a lower life expectancy as well?
No, and that I was going to put in that I have some reticence in using this 1950s label, pro and con. I think this is where we need to use technology to give us the appropriately better lifestyle, to have the medical services, for instance, and better communication and education. But if we're using technology to replace our plasma TV with an even bigger one, or a 3D one, or something of that nature, that's the wrong way to use it. So 1950s in terms of materials use, but not necessarily in terms of our social well-being.
But it's not inconceivable, given that life expectancy reversed rapidly in Eastern Europe after the Berlin Wall came down. We could see a reversal on life expectancy.
That might well be the case if those numbers play out.
Thanks very much for that.